This time of year is when the male bumblebees start to come out. So we have around 15 bumblebee species in Massachusetts. There's around 230 species around the world. This is a male. So this time of year, the colony will start producing both males and new queens. And for some species, it's really easy to tell if they're a male. This is a male Bombus griseocolus, so the brown-belted bumblebee, which is our second most common bumblebee species. Bombus impatiens, which we will also see today, is relatively common as well. So you'll notice as you pass him around, he's really active in the jar. He has really big fly-like eyes, so that's one of the tools you can use to distinguish him. He also has pretty skinny legs, so he lacks any pollen-carrying structures. You will see that he has pollen on his body, just because bumblebees are hairy. So as they move, as he goes to flowers to collect nectar, he'll often still pick up pollen on his body, which is kind of good news for the plant because other female bumblebees have really specialized structures on their back legs to transport pollen, so we'll catch some females as well, and you'll be able to see what that looks like. But when the pollen is really tightly packed like that, less pollen is likely to transfer to another plant, right? Which is what the plant wants, is to have pollen transferred from flower to flower. But for him, the pollen is really loosely packed kind of on his hairs because he doesn't have any of those specialized structures. So we call those scopa, which are really hairs that are branched. And the branching in the hairs allows pollen to stick really well to those hairs, but males don't have those. Some females have clusters of hairs on their back legs. That's most common. Bumblebees and honeybees have corbicula, which are still scopa, but they're in a very specific arrangement on their back legs. And then we have a group of bees, which we may see as well, I saw some earlier, that collect pollen on the underside of their belly. And those are mason bees, all of our Megachilidae, which are the leafcutter bees and the mason bees. And I will release him and catch something else. So males actually have an extra abdominal segment and an extra antennal segment. So in some bees, that's really pronounced, like longhorn bees, they have really, really long antennae, the males do. But for him, generally with male bumblebees, they just have sort of a lankier appearance, which once you get a little more familiar with seeing females and then seeing a male, the contrast makes it a little easier to tell. But you'll never see males carrying that tightly packed pollen on their bodies because they don't have those structures. So for male bumblebees, you know, the queen comes out that's overwintered. She'll forage on her own for a little bit, and then she'll find like an abandoned rodent hole sometime in the spring. Sometimes they'll also nest in like tufts of grass. We have some species that do that as well. And then she'll start laying her female workers. And once her female workers are out and they're foraging, the queen will never leave the colony again. And by this time of year, it's kind of at peak abundance. You know, it varies slightly based on species and how healthy the colony is. But this time of year, you start to see the queen will lay more male eggs, which are unfertilized eggs. And then the males come out, they'll mate with new queens from other colonies, and then just one queen will overwinter. So by the first frost that we get, all of the workers, the old queen, the males will die, and then a new mated female will overwinter by herself. And she won't stay in the colony, so they'll overwinter in like leaf litter, sometimes in really shallow soil or moss, something like that. In Massachusetts, we have bumblebees, which are social, and then we have honeybees, which are not native but are highly social, and their colony is perennial, so it persists over many years, so the queen might live for like 4 or 5 years. And then most of our bees, though, about 70% are solitary. So that's one female, like that metallic green bee that we saw. One female excavates a nest on her own, lays all of her eggs, and she may only lay like 5 to 10 eggs in her whole lifetime. So the rate of production or reproduction for solitary bees is actually really low compared to other insects, compared to like a fly, which may lay, you know, thousands of eggs. So really low rate of reproduction. They're really docile as well. So we've got some Monarda here, two different kinds of bee balm, which is pretty popular amongst bees. It's starting to finish up. This is Joe Pyeweed. It's one of our really good fall bloomers. So in the aster family, Monarda is in the mint family, so it's a big nectar producer. So it's really popular with a variety of bees. Large carpenter bees will actually rob the nectar from bee balm because you can see it's got these really long tubular flowers, which is great for bees with long tongues or really small bees that can crawl fully inside to get to the nectar that's produced at the base of the flower. But for large carpenter bees, which is the largest bee species that we have in New England, they are too big to fit. And so they have those big mandibles that they use to excavate nests in wood. So they'll actually sit on the flower petal and cut a slit in the base of the flower and then stick their tongue in it and forage that way, which from the plant's perspective, we call it nectar robbing, because they're taking resources from the flower without actually contacting any of the reproductive parts that are sticking up closer to the entrance. So obviously from the flower's perspective, it wants the bee to come into contact with the anthers, which pollen is produced at the tip of the anther, or the stigma, which is the sticky female part. But for a flower that's been robbed, now it lost resources which require energy to produce, and did not get any opportunity to set seed. So sometimes we think of bees being like our nature's altruists and they're pollinating plants for the good of it, but really they just want to eat and reproduce themselves. So whatever offers the greatest opportunity for efficiency is generally what bees are going to do. Not every time they visit a flower are they pollinating. You can tell with females if they're foraging for nectar or pollen, because when they forage for pollen, they have usually sort of this like frantic nature that they move over the flower as they're trying to collect pollen either onto their belly or onto their back legs. And when they're nectaring, they tend to be pretty still. So they'll land on the flower and they nectar at rest, which is different from something like a hummingbird, which always nectars while it's in flight. And so you'll see with flowers that the sugar content of the nectar they produce is actually specific to their focal pollinator. So hummingbirds prefer a much more liquidy nectar with a lower sugar content, because that's easier to consume while they're in flight. And so those plants that rely on hummingbirds for pollination produce a lower sugar content nectar, whereas for bees, they like a really high sugar content nectar, because the more water is in the nectar is like basically presents a cost to them. This is a female eastern large carpenter bee. So again, the biggest bee that we have, and there's a really easy way to tell the female carpenter bees from the males. So if we see a male, I'll point it out. But you can see if you look at her face, she's got an all black face, right? Her body's black, her face is black. With males, they'll have a big white mark on their face, and that's how you'll know that they're males. The males tend to be kind of territorial, especially at the beginning of the season when they're protecting their nest site. But again, they can't sting at all, but they'll like buzz around each other, they'll fight each other. Sometimes if you're like walking under a wooden structure where they've nested, they like to kind of dive bomb people, but it's really just the males that exhibit that behavior and they can't sting. But the females are really chill, and a lot of times they're mistaken for bumblebees, but the easiest way to tell them apart is if you look at her abdomen, it's shiny and black. So bumblebees will always have a hairy abdomen, even though bumblebees may have, different colorations on their abdomen, as we'll talk about. She's got a shiny black abdomen. If you look at her thorax, which is their middle segment between their head and their abdomen, she has a really distinct bald spot, circular bald spot on her thorax as well. So they've got that like dusty golden hair and then a circle on their thorax. And that's how you can instantly tell that it's a carpenter bee. So she loves plants like this, nectar-rich plants this time of year. They're generalists, so they'll collect pollen from a variety of plant species and then go back to their nest and deposit it. And they exhibit kind of interesting social behavior. Sometimes they're fully solitary, but sometimes they live in small groups with other females where there may be, a female or two that remains in the nest and cares for offspring, and then females that are more actively foraging. So they exhibit a unique sort of social structure that we call subsociality, which isn't very common in bees. They're usually either solitary or social to some level, but they're kind of in the middle and will oscillate between different things. Yeah, the question is, someone heard that bumblebees are better pollinators than honeybees and like asking about the differences and pollination efficacy between different bee groups, which is a really good question. And there definitely are differences among bees. Sometimes it really depends on the plant. So a really classic example are commercial blueberries, or wild blueberries, which are also native here. Blueberries are in the Ericaceae family. They have those bell-shaped flowers that are characteristic to that family. which make it rather difficult for a honeybee to get inside the flower. And so we do have a specialist, actually several specialist bees here that specialize on the Ericaceae family, one that's called the blueberry bee, which is really efficient at pollinating those plants. But bumblebees have this ability to wrap their whole body around a flower and shake out the pollen. So that's what we call buzz pollination. So that's why bumblebees are really helpful in blueberry pollination. So oftentimes in a commercial blueberry production, you'll see that honeybees are still brought in to add supplemental services, partly because in like a monocultural setting, there's not great habitat usually, or the soil is regularly disturbed, or there's weed mat put down to control weeds. And most bees, again, are solitary and nest in the soil. So that means there's not a lot of opportunity for them to actually persist in that environment. Sometimes like in adjacent habitat, depending on what that is. But that means for the most part, honeybees will end up doing most of the pollination, but the bumblebees that visit the flowers are more efficient at actually leading. So anytime we talk about pollination, you think about the number of visits total and then the efficiency or effectiveness of those individual visits. So for a lot of bees, they're more efficient than honeybees at pollinating, but the sheer number of honeybees in like an agricultural landscape where you may have 80,000 bees per colony and they're trucking in like, 20 plus colonies, that's a lot, that's millions and millions of bees versus, you may have a couple wild bumblebee colonies that have dozens or hundreds of workers that are really efficient, but the sheer number is different. Like I mentioned earlier, honeybees aren't native here. Sometimes they persist in feral colonies, but they tend to die really easily because there's so many pathogens and pests that honeybees struggle with, which is why beekeepers they struggle to keep colonies alive even when they do everything right. But we have certain bees that carry pollen internally. So I don't know if we'll see them today. They're really tiny. They're called hylaeus. They're mast bees. They have no external body hair for the most part because they carry all of their pollen inside and then regurgitate it when they get back to the nest, kind of like a mother bird. And for that reason, they may not be as efficient at pollinating like the bumblebee we saw where even the male had pollen sticking to his body. So it does depend on their body structure, their size. But flies, for example, are widely considered the second most important group of pollinators. That would be like syrphid flies or flower flies, which they're great because as adults, they visit flowers for nectar. When they're developing, feed on aphids primarily and some other insects as well. So they kind of have this dual element of pest control services and pollination services. They lack a lot of body hair. Their legs are really long and skinny, so they're not always contacting the reproductive parts of the plant. But there's so many of them in some settings that the number of total visits helps sort of make up for the lack of efficiency in their visits overall. And butterflies are kind of the same way. They have really long, skinny legs, so they're not necessarily the best, most efficient pollinator, but they can contribute to pollination services. Bees are efficient and effective, so that's why bees are widely considered the most important pollinator around the world. If you look at this bee flying around also, it's a really fast flyer. It's going to come back around. It's got yellow and black stripes. And that's our European wool carder bee. So it's also non-native. They're kind of considered invasive as well, but the classification is kind of different depending on where you go. They're in the Megachilidae family, so they collect pollen on the underside of their bellies, but the females will actually collect trichomes from plants, so the little fuzzy hairs on the underside of leaves, and that's what they use to line their nests. But the male Anthidium, the male wool carder bees, they can't sting, but they have spikes on the end of their abdomen, and they're pretty aggressive towards other bees. So they've been documented attacking, or here's a male, even killing other bees. And they'll go for, here he is, even like bumblebees, but they're really fast. He'll literally just patrol this plant because this is his plant of choice. And mountain mint is blooming right now, which this is mountain mint. It's another really nectar-rich plant. So as you can see, it's like really covered in honeybees. And I know there's honeybees at the botanical garden, so this might be one of their preferred nectar sources. You also tend to see a fair number of native wasps on mountain mint. So this is a really good sort of later summer nectar producer. It does produce some pollen, but it's great when you're building pollinator habitat to consider plants that are both nectar rich, which are a lot of plants in the mint family, like bee balm, like mountain mint, and then also include plants that are really pollen rich as well, which are a lot of asters are really resource rich, which is also why there's so many specialists on asters. But we have lots of other big pollen producers as well, which are good for different times of the year. The question was sort of related to like bee intelligence and communication. And there's a lot of research going on with bumblebees specifically, how they communicate. Social bees are generally at an advantage in landscapes, especially like fragmented urban landscapes, because they have the ability to communicate with one another. Honeybees are really famous for their waggle dance, which, you know, a female forager, comes back to the colony, and then she will kind of rotate her abdomen around in space, and that indicates to other bees where resources are located. So you see a lot of communication with social bees. Bumblebees will do the same thing. They don't necessarily do the waggle dance, but they'll use like trophallaxis or antenation. So antenation is kind of like rubbing their antennae together, and then trophallaxis is an exchange of liquids through their tongue. So all of that can kind of inform them where resources are. But most bees, again, are solitary, so they're not necessarily communicating with other bees, but what they do have to do is learn how to handle flowers. Everything they do takes energy, and so they're always working to become more efficient. We have 400 species here in Massachusetts. Most of them are generalists. Most of them are solitary and live in the soil. One of the important things about solitary bees is that their active period is much shorter than social bees. So bumblebees you'll see from like spring through fall. But for a lot of solitary bees, their lifespan is a matter of weeks. And so it's really important that when they emerge, that there's floral resources for them. In Massachusetts, it's really easy to plant a lot of summer blooming flowers or even fall blooming flowers, but spring is a really important time. And overall, we have a really short growing season in Massachusetts compared to a lot of the other parts of the country. But we do have some early spring plants like willow, dogwood, wood betony that provide really important resources early in the year. And sometimes those are for specialists, but sometimes they're also just for queen bumblebees that are emerging, or again, other solitary bees that just tend to come out a little earlier in the year. Typically, you'll also see wasps on it, sometimes butterflies on it as well. We do have a lot of wasp species in New England as well. So there's over 400 bee species in New England, but there's actually over 1,000 wasp species in New England. So wasps are a really, really diverse group. What makes them different from bees is that for the most part, wasps are collecting insects for their offspring, and that's their protein source. So bees evolved from wasps. So bees are wasps, but wasps aren't bees, and they have a single common ancestor. Everything started out as a wasp. Eventually, bees kind of realized that pollen was a more efficient method to collect protein for their offspring. You don't have as much energy expended hunting that female solitary wasps do. And that's when they kind of branched off. Of course, in ecology, there's like always exceptions, and there are some bee species that will feed on carrion or scavenge. And then we also have some wasp species that feed their offspring with pollen. So kind of an interesting, there's always little differences in ecology, but for the most part, that's how you can distinguish them. But other than that, they're really taxonomically similar. So the main visual differences you'll see are that bees have these hairs and they will collect pollen. So she is a female Bombus impatiens. So again, this is the most common bumblebee species that we have. And she's got her little pollen balls on her back leg. So if you look at her compared to the male, you'll see that she's got kind of like a dusty orange pollen on her back leg. One of the reasons bees are really good pollinators too is, like I mentioned, they tend to exhibit floral constancy. So for a bumblebee, even though she'll theoretically visit all sorts of plants that are in bloom, on one foraging trip, she tends to be really loyal to a particular plant species. And that's good because plants don't really want to be contaminated at the stigma with pollen from a bunch of different species, because that's not going to help it reproduce, right? So the bee will visit, flowers either all from mountain mint or all from bee balm or all from goldenrod, and she tends to stick to that plant. So that's why too, on her back legs, the pollen tends to be one color. But on different trips, she may come back with a different color pollen. They tend to exhaust a resource as long as it's in bloom and efficient. One of the biggest struggles for bee populations is habitat loss, but also habitat fragmentation, where the distance in between habitats becomes larger and larger. So bees and wasps, ants, and sawflies are all in the order Hymenoptera, they're all insects, right? They're all under the insect class. and then you get into order. So bees and wasps are really closely related, and then butterflies and moths make up the order Lepidoptera, so a different order of insects. And some of them feed as adults, some of them don't. So that's what's kind of interesting about them. Of course, when their offspring, rather than their offspring feeding on pollen, their offspring feed on plant tissues. So when we talk about host plants for bees, we're talking about a pollen source. When we talk about host plants for butterflies or moths, we're talking about plants. So that's why, you know, the monarch butterfly, of course, is the most famous example of that, where their offspring will only feed on milkweed flowers or milkweed plants as they develop. And lots of bees will visit milkweed, but not for the same purpose. And so adults sometimes don't feed at all. Sometimes moths or butterflies will actually feed in their larval stage. They'll go through their chrysalis, their butterfly, their cocoon if they're a moth. They emerge as an adult and they'll never feed again. They'll just, you know, lay eggs if they're a female. But a decent number of our butterfly species and moth species do feed on nectar as adults, and that's just their carbohydrate source, right? Just like for us, it's like their quick carbohydrate to power flight. So you'll find that, you know, monarch butterflies, for example, they're really specialized on where they're going to oviposit or lay their eggs. But you'll see them on red clover, you'll see them on, you know, all sorts of different flowers. Butterflies tend to like flat flowers with like a landing pad. So that way they can rest while they're foraging, and they have like long tongues that they'll stick into flowers. Versus again, like a hummingbird, they tend to be associated with like purple, red, tubular flowers. Wasps really like the color yellow. So that's why you'll see a lot of wasps on goldenrod, because their eyesight is really adapted to see yellow colors well. They also like white, so they'll be on mountain mint too. Versus bees, which depending on the bee species, sometimes they have more close floral associations based on their tongue length or their body size. Right here is the northern paper wasp, which is also called the dark paper wasp. We have two paper wasp species in New England. One of them is invasive, and the European paper wasp, which they're really easy to distinguish because the European paper wasp looks kind of like a yellow jacket. It's got yellow and black coloring. But our northern paper wasp is dark in color, which is why it's also called the dark paper wasp. And they are typically specialized in hunting caterpillars. That can be really good in a garden setting because they'll hunt like tomato, hornworms, armyworms, insects that are viewed as garden pests. And sometimes they'll also hunt different caterpillars as well. But what a wasp does, what makes them really skilled hunters, is that the females, again, are the only ones that are actively foraging because they're the only ones that possess a stinger. And stinging is really central to a wasp's life cycle, because what the female does when she finds a caterpillar is she'll sting the caterpillar to paralyze the caterpillar with the venom. So the caterpillar's not dead, but it can't move. And then she'll transport it back to her nest, lay an egg on it, and then the larvae will slowly consume that caterpillar. So it's not a great way to go as a caterpillar, but it's some wasps will hunt caterpillars. We have the largest wasp species in Massachusetts is the eastern cicada killer, which they look really large and intimidating, but they're solitary. The females, given their name, only hunt cicadas, and they're really, really skilled at hunting cicadas. So cicadas are much bigger than that wasp, even though it's the biggest wasp species we have. So they'll kind of like dive bomb from trees to sting cicadas, and then they'll typically like drag them really close to the ground all the way back to their nest. And so you may find a burrow with like a ton of cicadas in it that she uses to feed her offspring. But not all wasps hunt live animals. Sometimes they'll also scavenge as well. Or like if you have a barbecue outside, there's a misconception that the yellow jackets that you see are like chewing up meat, or they're actually eating that meat, but they lack the ability to process protein as an adult. So they have really simple mouth parts similar to bees. So they have lapping mouth parts that allow them to lap at nectar and sugars, but they can't digest protein. What they'll do sometimes is they'll find, you know, if it's like a rib and there's still some pieces of meat on the outside, is they'll put it in their mouth, they'll kind of chew it up to make like a paste, and then they'll bring it back to their nest and deposit it there, and then they'll lay eggs on that. Towards this time of year, especially around like Labor Day weekend, the wasp colony, the social colony for paper wasps, for yellow jackets, for what were previously called bald-faced hornets, but they're not actually a true hornet. They're a yellow jacket, an aerial nesting yellow jacket. Their colonies collapsing, which very similar to bumblebees. It's one queen that will overwinter on her own, and then she'll found a nest the following year. And social wasps have this kind of interesting interaction where the larvae, as they're developing, produce like a sweet, sugary substance, and the adults will actually feed on that. And by the end of the summer, there's no more larvae being produced, right? Because the colony is going to collapse. They're putting more effort into males and new queens for next year. And so the adults are coming back to the colony with their food, and they're not getting anything back. And so that's when you see a lot more wasps. It's not that there's more wasps at the end of the summer, it's just that they're out more, either on nectar-rich flowers, or that's when, if you're having a picnic and you have watermelon or you have beer or you have anything with sugar in it, they're like dying for sugar because they don't have any more in the colony. And so sometimes people will see more wasps that time of year because they're just noticing them more. But that's really kind of their last ditch effort before they die, to like feed, give them nectar-rich plants somewhere else. So they really like goldenrod. Any nectar-rich plants will do for them, but they have a really interesting life cycle. Bees are unique in that they collect pollen. Both they eat pollen when they're developing, and they collect pollen as adults. But wasps and flies are really great because they provide pest control services in the developing stages, and then potentially pollination services as well. And even when wasps are hunting, they can provide pollination services because they're usually waiting on flowers or hovering around flowers to try and catch something. There's 6 bee families found in Massachusetts, and there's 7 bee families around the world. One of the 7th bee family, which we don't have here, is comprised of 21 species in Western Australia only. So very specific there. So we have every other family. Apidae is the biggest bee family. That's honeybees. It's honeybees, bumblebees, carpenter bees that we've seen, longhorn bees, which we haven't seen yet. Big diverse group, a lot of parasitic bees in the family Apidae as well. And then we've got Halictidae, which this bee belongs to. That's the 2nd largest bee family, commonly called sweat bees because sometimes they'll land on humans to lick sweat to obtain minerals. But we also have a much smaller bee family called Melitidae as well, which we have oil collecting bees in Massachusetts too. So Melitidae is another small bee family. There's only about 200 species around the world compared to Apidae, which has over 6,000 species around the world. And they, rather than collecting nectar, collect oil from fringed yellow loosestrife, which is a native plant that we have here, different from the invasive purple loosestrife. And so they're typically associated with wherever fringed yellow loosestrife is found, those bees tend to be found. And they have these really beautiful hairs on their back legs, which are specialized to sort of like mop up the floral oils on those plants. So they'll provide their offspring with this mixture of both pollen and floral oils that they'll feed on, typically in place of nectar as well. So the health of a queen bumblebee going into overwintering is really important. So basically, the fatter she is, the more likely she is to survive. And so fall blooming plants are really important for lots of bees, but especially queen bumblebees, because they require that to build up fat stores and survive for multiple months in New England, where she may be under snowpack. You know, they're not emerging. We don't have any winter blooming plants. And so they really have to stick it out. And so when willows come into bloom, when you start seeing those first like 55, 60 plus degree days, is when you might start looking for queen bumblebees. But you're only going to see them if there's something in bloom. So you may get like a one-off day where it's nice, but nothing's in bloom yet, so you won't see them. They'll come out, they'll forage to make their ovaries productive and to found a nest. So if you see a bumblebee that's really big, that's the easiest way to tell them apart. Early season or late season, really big bumblebee. Because the queens are only different in size from their workers, that's it, versus a honeybee, which is very morphologically different from her workers. She'll come out and she'll kind of exhibit in the spring this, like, she'll hover over the ground, and she's not looking for plants, she's looking for a place to start a nest. And so again, they love abandoned rodent holes. Sometimes they'll do like tufts of grass. Sometimes they'll be their compost piles, they've been found in there. So for the most part, abandoned rodent holes, cavities, where they like to be, but most of them won't be successful. And so the more fall resources we have, the more spring resources we have are helpful in terms of keeping them at least fed. But then other conditions, of course, can play into that as well. So leaf litter, is where a lot of them like to overwinter. And so, you know, if you let your leaves fall and then you let them sit until, say, like November, when we're far past the point of having our first frost, and then you decide like you're sick of the leaves, you want to, you know, get rid of them and ship them off, you know, somewhere, then that can be disruptive to any insects that have started overwintering. So usually, like, best practices would be to remove them as soon as possible after they fall. And usually, you know, decide a designated area where you're okay with leaves remaining from before the first frost until everything thaws out in the spring. So that way you've kind of created this area where not just queen bumblebees, but you'll get, like, you know, those flower flies that I was talking about, lots of different insects, well, beetles, will overwinter in that designated area. And then you haven't created what we call an ecological trap, which is where, you know, if you leave the leaves for a little too long, insects think it's a great overwintering site, and then the leaves are then taken away later, is like kind of the worst thing that can happen for them. So it's very reasonable to not leave the leaves everywhere, but choosing ahead of time. Generally, when we talk about like best practices for creating pollinator habitat, we've touched on some of them already, but first and foremost, just variety, right? Variety of plants will provide a variety of visual features, morphological features, bloom times, and all these things that we ultimately are trying to capture. For the most part, in pollinator designed habitat, right? If you're creating a habitat or managing a habitat to try and increase pollinator visitation and diversity, emphasizing straight species native plants is important. There's sometimes a lot of questions on native cultivars, which have become pretty popular. And for the most part, it's a case-by-case basis. So some cultivars of plants are much less attractive to pollinators than the straight species native. That's not always the case. So the best rule of thumb is how morphologically similar does the cultivar look or grow to its parent plant, which in the case of a hydrangea, for example, the hydrangea cultivars that are really popular throughout New England are really big, fluffy inflorescences, right? And those have been selected to produce a lot of sterile flowers because those are the big showy flowers on hydrangeas. And so the hydrangea cultivars offer far less resources to pollinators than the native type or the near native type we have, smooth hydrangea in New England. However, for other cultivars, some of them have been selected from the wild and just been given a name. And that could be like natural color variation in the petals, anything like that. So you kind of have to look at the plant and decide, you know, how different does this look? But some cultivars, like one really popular one, we have Achillea millefolium, which is common yarrow, which is native here. The really popular cultivar is actually a hybrid cultivar called Moonshine, which is a cross between our native type and a Mediterranean type of yarrow. And for that reason, Moonshine is really drought tolerant. And so it also produces like a silvery foliage. So it's really common in city plantings because it's pretty. People tend to like yellow flowers better than white flowers. And it's also drought tolerant. So again, there's certain considerations that you might make for, you know, the overall drought tolerance of your habitat or color introduction into your habitat as well. And then there's other cultivars like the American chestnut where you don't really want to buy the straight species native species at all. You want to buy the blight resistant cultivar. So those are all important considerations as well. But generally you want to think about emphasizing straight species natives, adding in a few cultivars. You may add in, you know, some ornamentals as well. Like lavender, of course, isn't native, but it's in the mint family. It's really popular with honeybees, bumblebees, certain butterflies, and it has like some culinary value, aesthetic value that people recognize. So you can sort of smartly plan out all sorts of different things. You know, it doesn't have to be one size fits all. Incorporating a difference in flower height is also somewhat helpful because if we think about it, bees are always competing with each other all the time for resources, whether it's bees in their same species or other species. And so the more we have diversity in the height of those flowers, the more airspace they have to fly through. And they tend to exhibit height fidelity on their foraging trips. Just like with resources, they'll forage at a similar height. And so if we have flowers at different heights, that means bees aren't necessarily bumping into each other as much.